It's really incredible to think about how much aesthetic sensibility is defined by the limitations of the time in which a piece of media is made. For instance, if you look at black and white cinema, it was made that way because color did not exist in cinema yet, and yet there was so much that had to be done to a film to make it look correct in black and white, and this has continued to evolve over time. You look at CG movies and how, because of the limitations of CG or the limitations of what a budget can do with CG, there's all these camera tricks and lighting techniques that are used to sort of obfuscate the CG so that it looks better on screen. And this is the case in every medium. They're all constantly evolving with their aesthetic matching to meet with the demands of technology or with the demands of whatever platform they're being released on. And when it comes to video games, you see this in a really interesting way because different consoles, not only by way of their technology, but even just by way of how they're played, will have very different aesthetics from one another, very different identities. For instance, Game Boy Advanced games tended to have these very bright and colorful palettes. They were very pastel and cutesy because of the fact that the Game Boy Advanced was a handheld console with no backlight. Every game had to be very bright for you to even really be able to see it on your handheld console. Now that we're viewing these games on computer monitors or with the backlit Game Boy Advanced SP or the Nintendo DS or any of those other consoles, they look unbelievably bright. They look much brighter than other games of their style. I mean, if you look at a Super Nintendo game, which has the same kind of graphics, the same kind of graphical capabilities, the color palettes are always way darker and more muted. Just compare a Zelda game for the Super Nintendo against a Zelda game on the Game Boy Advanced, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Not to say that none of this has to do with art style, but as someone who's played a considerable amount of the Game Boy Advance library, it's a definite trend that these games are usually brighter. Now, personally, I'm a huge fan of this aesthetic. I really like how bright and poppy all these Game Boy Advance games look. And even though I know that the reason they look this way has a lot to do with the limitations of the console, with trying to make pixel graphic games that will look alright through a non-backlit handheld console, I do wish that this aesthetic was still being done in a big way. Because while there are lots and lots of pixel art games coming out still to this day, only a handful of them really try to capture a specific console aesthetic. If you look at a game like You Have to Win the Game, or VVVVVV, these are games that are like specifically trying to look like one specific console. And I know some people would see that as sort of a nostalgia gimmick or something, or see it as, well, those games already existed in the past, why do we need to keep recreating them now? But I think that we haven't necessarily explored every permutation of those old styles. And I mean, this is not to knock games having a whole new style that's totally original. That can be great. But I do have to wonder if maybe there are things to be explored about the old Game Boy Advanced style, for instance, that haven't been because it kind of waned with the GBA. There's not a lot of games that copy that same specific type of super bright and poppy pixel art. It really makes me think about music and how musical genre has been so tied to different methods of recording, and how it seems like there's an obvious improvement in recording quality over time, and like you would want to make things sound cleaner and better because we have the technology to do that now, but I don't know that the results of that always give us the aesthetic we're looking for. For instance, the band Black Sabbath was one of the first metal bands to ever gain notoriety. By today's standards, they would largely be seen as a doom metal band, insofar as doom metal is a genre where bands generally try to sound like Black Sabbath. Now, if you listen to old Black Sabbath, which was recorded in like the 60s and 70s, then it's got this very fuzzy, psychedelic feeling to it. It feels very of its time. And they did have more psychedelic type of breaks in some of their songs, but even their more heavy metal stuff has this very fuzzy feeling to it, this sort of druggy atmosphere. And that atmosphere is as influential as the music itself. It's not just about what riffs they're playing, what notes they're playing. It's about how those things are portrayed. There's heavy distortion. There's this very fuzzed out feeling, and even the recording itself, has that fuzziness, and that's integral to what the genre is. Now, if you listen to newer Black Sabbath records, they don't have that effect anymore, because as technology improved, they used better recording technology and more modern recording technology. But the question is, did the vibe remain the same? Meanwhile, bands that try to play in the style of Black Sabbath will often deliberately imitate the sound of the 70s. They'll try to make their recording sound worse in the name of capturing that atmosphere. For a great example, take a look at Uncle Acid and the Deadbeats. This is a 2010s band. They did not make any music before the 2010s. They sound like they were recorded in the 70s because they're trying to capture that specific fuzzy 70s psychedelia vibe. And they offer enough unique to the table. They're not just Black Sabbath. They're not just any of those bands from that era. They have their own twist on it with these very eerie sort of demonic vocals that they bring, or these really ripping, shredding guitar solos that they often end their songs on. Their structure of tracks is a little different, a little bit more modern, and yet uses the aesthetic of these older bands in order to convey what they want to convey. And so I have to wonder how interesting it could be if older consoles were sort of given this treatment, which, I mean, again, they have been in some indie games. Some games like VVVVVV that goes out of its way to be a Commodore 64 game, or Shovel Knight, which goes out of its way to be a sort of advanced version of an NES game. You can clearly tell this game could not have been made on the NES, just in terms of cartridge space, but it uses only elements that did exist in the NES library. It's only built of pieces the NES was capable of doing. Just, it couldn't have done all of them at once in the way that this game does. So the game that you're watching me play through right now is Hamtaro Ham Heartbreak. It's a Game Boy Advanced game that's based on an anime series that I think is based on a manga series called Hamtaro. If I'm correct, Hamtaro originated as a shoujo manga, but it's very child-oriented. The original manga, I think, is a bit more girly, but the anime series is just a general children's cartoon, a little bit more broad-focused. And this show was aired in the US on Cartoon Network in the early 2000s. Now, when Hamtaro was on TV, I was maybe just a little bit too old for it, but I have two younger brothers who were a little closer to the age range for the show, and we ended up watching a considerable amount of it. It's a very entertaining little episodic adventure, sort of slice of life series, just about a bunch of adorable hamsters who have their own sort of culture, and it's about them hanging out and doing stuff. Sort of like a Winnie the Pooh kind of vibe that you would get from this show. Now, I don't really have any specific memories of Hamtaro. I remember generally who the characters were, but I don't remember much of what happened. I remember the whole opening theme, but it's been well over, probably over 13 years since I saw any of it. And again, I was never a diehard fan or anything, but it was just a show that I saw, enough of to vaguely recall. And the most interesting thing I remember about it is the fact that my family actually got two hamsters. We bought, I guess, two hamsters, and we named them Biju and Boss, after the girl hamster from Hamtaro, Biju, who you'll be seeing in this video as the white hamster that is my assistant in this game. And Boss, who you'll also see in this game if I show the right footage. He gives you orders in this game. He sort of gives you direction and tells you where to go, though he plays a very minor role in this game. The hamsters we had we loved the idea of having hamsters, but me and my brothers have always been incredibly irresponsible, and we did not do much to take care of them. We never wanted to clean their cages. We never wanted to feed them, you know. My mom mostly did that, rather. Bijou died relatively early on my birthday. I had some friends over, and I think that maybe we were too loud, because supposedly hamsters are not fond of loud noises or sudden shock. You know, they can go into shock easily. They're very timid animals. And I think we were just too loud and she couldn't take it or something. And she died seemingly of shock that night. We buried her in the backyard before fucking off to go to Ocean Breeze Fun Park because it was my birthday. And then Boss had a much sadder, slower death where he just kind of became sickly from not being well taken care of enough. His fur started like falling out and stuff, and one day he climbed into a pipe, and like he had his mouth full, like he'd taken a big bite of something and then tried to go climb through the pipes, and he seemingly suffocated himself and he died. So yeah, the hamsters aren't really long lived anyways, but we definitely were not ready for that kind of responsibility as preteens and kids. Thankfully, the world of Hamtaro is nothing like real-world hamsters who lack any agency and have no idea the world they live in and are just difficult to keep alive. Hamtaro hamsters are smart and fun, and they have personalities, and they have their own little world that they explore. They're beloved by their caretakers. You know, they have a good time. Now, one of the most fun things about Hamtaro is that the hamsters have this sort of language, and it's mostly based around extremely simplistic words and sound effects. Now, one of the interesting things to know about the Japanese language is that there are these sort of repetitive sound effects for not just almost every action and like every verb, but also for like concepts and emotions. So for instance, the sound of a heartbeat, which would be doki doki, can mean your heart's fluttering because you're in love, or just one solid doki can mean that you're shocked by something. You've got emotions like fua fua, which means light and fluffy, but not really as in, I mean, it can mean, like, in a tactile way, it can mean that something is fua fua, but it could also mean that you feel fua fua. And so, yeah, like, all of these different sound effects both have a more literal meaning and a more emotional meaning. And Hamtaro takes advantage of this to an extreme extent, to the point that the hamsters don't have normal words for most things. They mostly communicate in these sound effects and will refer to actions by sound effect. For instance, in the English dub, when they were eating sunflower seeds, they would say crumb, 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 which meant eating. So if they said, like, if they wanted to eat something, they would say, I want to crumb, crumb that, you know, and then they would do so, and it would make that sound. In the Japanese, that would be paka paka paka, as I know from this game, because paka paka is the move you use to bite through things. So this whole sound effect nature is vitally important to this particular game, because this is basically an adventure game. Essentially, it's a baby's first adventure game. But what's interesting about it is that it's all about learning commands that you can use. You start off with 4 commands that are very basic. You can talk to people by saying ham ha, which is their greeting. You can do a rolling attack, you can dig, and you can look around, investigate, sniff. You sniff around, rather. You have those 4 at all times, but the rest of the game is about picking up commands to put into your hamster dictionary, which consists entirely of these sort of sound effect words. So if you talk to a hamster and you learn a sound effect, like maybe embarrassment, and then you go and talk to another hamster and you use the command embarrassment, then it might help to further the story. And so you're just basically learning all these different commands, some of which you'll use multiple times, some of which you'll really only use once. There's like 85 commands in the game, but it's really fascinating to see how this little language joke, this idea that because they're hamsters, you know, and they're not that intelligent, that they would kind of communicate like babies and use only sound effects, because it's a very young thing to do this. If you watch a lot of anime and you know Japanese pretty well, then you'll realize that in anime, characters under the age of 18 are often presented as speaking in a more simplistic way. They tend to use a lot of these sound effects. They tend to just talk in a more like infantilized manner, whereas adult characters will not usually do this and will have much more complicated and straightforward speaking. With the hamsters, it's like as dumbed down as it could be. They speak in extremely simplistic terms, including mostly sound effects, to the extent that it's so extreme that it almost doesn't even sound like the same language. Like, that's what kind of makes it unique, is that it's not just baby talk. It's like so extreme that it sounds like its own language of just using sound effects to communicate. And so this game is kind of all about that. It's about collecting sound effects and communicating them to one another. Now, the funny thing about doing that in an English translation is that some of that context is missing, and in some ways that's even better, because whereas in Japanese you would understand these to be sound effects that people use in everyday conversation, even in their language, just taken up to the extreme, in English it really feels like a whole different language. It feels as though the hamsters just have their own made-up words for everything that are vaguely connected to ours, and depending on how different it is, it can be kind of extreme, because a lot of the sound effects in this game, the translation is less of a sound effect and more of just a description of what it is. Whereas others, they tried to translate it to an English sound effect that's relatively similar, but we don't speak in sound effects here. So this really does feel like a totally unique language for these hamsters. And this has been a fascinating thing that's happened just in anime in general, because there are so many sound effects that are used in Japanese language. Just witnessing the different ways that different translators try to translate these things can be really fascinating. Like, for instance, with the phrase "fua fua," as I described earlier, which in the anime series K-On! Is extensively used in this song "Fua Fua Time," which means a light and fluffy time. In English, we can kind of extrapolate that light and fluffy could be an emotional state, and those are terms that we do use in criticism and stuff to say, like, oh, it's a very light feeling atmosphere. But it doesn't have quite the level of connotation in Japan that this just naturally means that thing. And it also doesn't necessarily convey the sense of nostalgia that can be associated with those terms that you would get in the Japanese usage of them. So it's a very interesting and complex world, and one of the most interesting things about translating Japanese to English is just this use of these sort of esoteric sound effects that have lots of different meanings, both in terms of physical meanings and in terms of more metaphorical meanings and emotional meanings. Now, the other nice thing about this game is that in addition to the sound effects, there are lots of little animations and bits of visual storytelling. Every single one of the sound effects has a unique animations for the hamsters to do. So even if you don't completely get the point of the phrasing, you can definitely understand the emotions based on the animations. So even if you cut out a lot of the dialogue in this game, it would still be totally readable just by way of these animations. And in fact, the opening cutscene has no dialogue at all. It's just pure visuals, and you completely understand what's happening just by way of these very simplistic little animations that easily communicate what's going on. And I really think there's a certain beauty in boiling things down to that extent, because while language can take us to incredibly complex depths of thought, we can use language to communicate things that are so out there and esoteric that they have no correlation to reality whatsoever. I feel like in our approach to language, in our deepening this complexity, we can often lose out on how to just communicate something simplistically. We lose out on the fact that as humans, we have such a shared experience amongst ourselves. We understand one another's emotions so easily that you can construct images that can communicate like an entire emotion just in one facial expression. And it's really interesting to me to see how many expressions are packed into this game. All 85 turns have some kind of expression. Not all of them necessarily make sense. Some of them are more puns or like metaphorical versions of the emotion being described, whereas a lot of them are very direct, and it can be really interesting to see how the animators went about communicating these different emotions in these incredibly simplistic ways. Hamtaro Ham Heartbreak is a fun game. It is a nice little relaxing game. I picked it up off of a list of recommended comfy games, and it is definitely very comfy. It exists in the vein of something like Animal Crossing, where there's no particular rush to get through the game. It's a very laid-back kind of story. It's just a simplistic adventure game, and even though it does feel very childish and it's pretty easy to figure out the mechanics and what's going on, it has just enough of a unique edge in the way that you communicate and the way that it uses the Hamtaro universe to create the nature of how you communicate with it, that I think it ends up being a pretty original and unique experience compared to other adventure games. And I also don't think it's completely childish or simplistic. There were moments where I just legitimately had no idea what to do. There's a character who will give you hints on the game, but even he has limits, and I did have to consult a strategy guide a couple of times just to figure out what I'd been missing at certain parts. I really think if I had played this game when I was younger, I probably would have had a great time with it, especially at the age when I was actually interested in Hamtaro. And it makes me think of how a game like this is so primed to fly right under the radar amongst video game fans. Because I do think this game has plenty to offer, even if you've never seen Hamtaro and know nothing about it. It communicates that world well enough on its own and has enough character in itself that you don't necessarily need to know the TV show to enjoy the game. But because this is a licensed game, which is something that has a stigma on it all by itself, even for me as a kid, by the time this game came out, and I was probably 12 or 13, even at that age I would have understood that a licensed game is not usually going to be good. I would have already played a few licensed games that I thought were terrible, and a game like this was never going to get rave reviews. And that kind of speaks to one of my biggest issues with the culture of reviews and the way that people interpret review scores, which is that, especially in video games, there's this sort of perception that if something's less than an 8 out of 10, then it's not worth bothering with. And I think there's a few reasons for this. One is that video gamers tend to skew younger, especially the ones who have lots of time to play lots of games. The older crowd might have to be more decisive about which games they play because of time, whereas the younger crowd has to be more decisive about which games they play because of money. In some cases, that might even be flipped. But the fact of the matter is that everyone's trying to chase the high of playing a great game. Everyone wants every game they play to be fantastic, and that's why people can be so let down when a new AAA game comes out and it's merely good as opposed to amazing, because every big game is expected to be amazing. But the problem is that not everyone has the same tastes, and review scores don't necessarily account for this very well. There have been plenty of big-name games that get incredibly well reviewed that just would not appeal to me at all. Whereas Hamtaro Ham Heartache, while I'm not going to go around saying it's a 10 out of 10 game, it's alright. It's a decent 7. I think that there's a lot more for me in this game than there would be in a lot of more mainstream titles, in a lot of games that have a lot more going on, because this is just more primed to my taste. I like games that are relaxing and cute and adventurous, and where it's really about exploring and getting to intimately know this world. Even though it's not very big, you get a great sense of this place, and it feels sort of lived in, and you understand all the characters and what they're doing by the time you're done with it, which is really my style of game. And it's only because I am such a curious player that I would go around seeking out games that are maybe interesting as opposed to acclaimed that I found this game. I mean, I've never seen this in even a list of the best Game Boy Advance games. I've never seen it on any recommended list until I found this chart of comfy games specifically. And, because it stood out so much for me to see a Hamtaro game for the Game Boy Advance being recommended in any capacity, I thought, I definitely need to know what's the deal with this Hamtaro game. And I played it, and it was a good time, and I would highly recommend that if it seems like your type of game, you could give it a shot too. I will say the game is fairly repetitive, and after you've gotten a couple levels in, you might find yourself waning in interest. It's fairly short. I made it to the standard ending in just a day of playing. There is actually a post-game to this. And I mean, just imagine, a Hamtaro licensed game on the Game Boy Advance has a post-game where you can go around collecting all these more secret hidden objects and use them to finish off the last few relationships that you have to resolve. Because this game is all about resolving relationships between the hamsters that are around. So yeah, even after you beat the final boss, there's still more to do, and I think that's really interesting and cool. And even though the game is short, and even if I did all the bonus content, it would probably only tack on a couple of hours, that would have been a great handheld experience. And I'm thinking back to myself as a kid, someone who oftentimes didn't finish games just because I would get maybe 10 hours in and never play past that point. I think this is one of the few games that I probably would have played to completion. I probably would have used a strategy guide even more extensively on doing so, but I probably would have gone all the way to 100% on this game just because it's so comfortable and fun to play, and it's easy to pull out and play whenever. It saves just whenever you quit the game, so there's no concern about having to beat a certain amount of it in a certain amount of time. You can just pick it up, play as much as you want, and put it down. And that's something that I think is very valuable and maybe doesn't get talked about enough in reviews and review culture. I think there needs to be more focus on the way that we play games when people talk about games. But that's sort of a subject for another time. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Handfuls of Zen. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. And stick around for next time, just in case I decide to make another episode. If you'd like to have a somewhat more fua time of watching someone play a Game Boy Advance game, I also have a Let's Play channel where I'm currently running a show where me and my editor, Devu, played through Wario Land 4, which is another really excellent Game Boy Advance game, so if you want more of that, go check that out.